Okay, cool. So should we start with part one then, the compensation to attract talent? I've just reorganized just one or two questions towards the end, but so starting with the first one, which is that, I mean, Jimmy, obviously, Patrick, you've looked at the questions, but as we know, like the market is changing rapidly at the moment, and with remote working, it's becoming a massive challenge for companies to know how much to pay their staff. So how does an organization know what to pay in a market that is changing so quickly with everything that's going on?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and unfortunately, there's no super easy answer to that. Fortunately for me, because otherwise Payspective probably wouldn't exist. But fundamentally, I think there are two things to take into account. One is you'll just want to get your hands on as much data as you possibly can. I think paying just by gut feel or thinking, hey, the market is moving, I have to pay X, or I have to give an X% raise, it can sometimes go wrong, can sometimes go right, but it can also go spectacularly wrong. I think, for instance, in the last few years, we've seen tech salaries pick up really, really quickly. And if you just offered candidates the same that you offered them 2 years ago, because that's sort of what your gut says, or you think, pay a 5% raise per year, that should work, then you're very likely to get a lot of offers rejected. So I think it's really, really important to just have access to the latest data. Now, your follow-up question on that would be, where should the data come from?
Read my mind.
I think there's a few ways, depending on what exactly you're looking for. If you're looking for data for one specific role that you're trying to hire, I think you'd be surprised by how much you can get out of your network. VCs typically have a lot of data, or can connect you to other companies that they're working with that typically will have hired for the same kind of role relatively recently. Sometimes also public data sources like LinkedIn or Glassdoor can be good starting points. Frankly, they're not immensely reliable, and you might run into issues in terms of how recent the data is and how comparable it is. But still, there's quite a lot you can get from public sources to sort of narrow it down. What is a competitive package? Then I think when you do need something more comprehensive, or when you want to really pin it down to what exactly you should pay, it usually does pay off to just buy data or benchmarks, because what you'll want to make sure is to get apple-to-apple comparisons and to get really recent data. If you're a 50-person startup, you won't want to compare yourself to Amazon and Google, but you will want to have you will want to know what other startup scale-ups at a similar size as you have paid for a similar role in the last few months. Obviously, that's something where we're supporting a lot with Payspective, and where we feel like this focus on the startup and scale-up world is really important, because otherwise you just don't have this apple-to-apple comparison. So yeah, I think having access to the latest data is sort of just a prerequisite to know how much to pay, because gut feel doesn't really cut it.
How often do you think organizations should update those data sets?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, again, it probably depends on the stage of the organization. If you're a 10-person startup and a lot of what you're offering is anyway opportunity, growth potential, stock options, and you know that you're offering people less salary than they could make somewhere else, then it's probably less important to update that data super regularly, because you'll know it'll just be, are you 20% under market or 25% under market, but you will be under market when it comes to basic salary. When you're a larger company and you're hiring 2 people every week, you're in a high growth phase, you're going from startup to scale up, then you'll want more. You'll just always want to make sure that you have access to recent data, and you'll probably want to do it on a biannual basis, like a company-wide benchmarking. But ideally, you'd make sure that you have access to a tool that is kind of interactive, where you always have access to the latest and greatest and can just go in and look at what current benchmarks are as you're hiring. So in overall, I would say the larger your company, the more often you wanna get a updated comprehensive benchmarking. If you're hiring a lot, just make sure you have access to a tool that automatically updates, where you always have access to the latest and greatest.
Okay. And talking about hiring, if companies are going through a lot of hiring, sorry, it's just another question that I'm going to throw in just because I'm interested to hear your thoughts on it. But there's a lot of debate that's been going around about advertising salaries on job descriptions. So what's your take on that, and how do you think companies should approach that? What are the kind of pros and cons on it?
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting question. So I think a big pro of advertising salary ranges or a salary on a job ad is that you just get more relevant candidates to apply. We've actually, our sister company Movement, they've done some research on this, and they saw that job ads with a salary, they just get more applicants and they get more relevant applicants, because people discount it a little bit when it just says competitive. They're like, well, if it's competitive, why don't you just put the number there? So I do think that it can help to get more people into the process when you have more information on the job ad, and it will also make sure that you get relevant people applying, right? Because if you're advertising a job or if you have a budget for a job between 40 and 50 grand, but you just say highly competitive and you get people applying who want at least 80 grand, then you'll interview them, they'll go through a really, really good process, and at the end they'll say, hey, my minimum expectation is 80 grand, and you'll have wasted a lot of time because you just can't afford them. So I think there's a lot to be said for advertising salaries. That being said, I think there are also situations where, especially if you're just not in a position to pay a high base salary, where you might miss out on some applications from people that are really, really relevant if you put that relatively low base salary that you can offer. And I think there are just some other things that you might be able to offer people that still make the package very competitive. Maybe you're offering a really, really big stock option package or a lot of equity. Maybe you offer crazy benefits. Maybe you have a huge growth potential or a big bonus potential. It's like a very commercial role where you offer a relatively low base salary but an uncapped bonus. Then if you just put the relatively low base number out there, you might get some people who might otherwise be interested in the opportunity to not even look at it. But actually the package that you're offering overall with options, with bonus, is actually really, really competitive. So I think potentially a way around that would just be to not only put base salary, but to frame it a little more in terms of total compensation. So to put on your job ad exactly that story, right? We are looking to pay a basic salary between X and Y, but there's also other elements to the compensation which are X, Y, Z. So I think more transparency is always better in terms of attracting good and relevant candidates to an opportunity. But if you know that your offer is not super strong on base salary, but really, really strong somewhere else, it might be difficult to just only advertise base salary and still get amazing candidates.
So kind of looking at the overall package and where your strengths are and making sure you advertise that to get the right people.
Yeah, absolutely. And you could translate the value of all of these other things, right? You could just have the objective value of the stock options that you award. You could have like the exact value of the bonus potential that you think will be awarded by the end of the year. I don't know, you could put, historically, we have awarded 70% of bonus potentials for this role. This would mean a total compensation of X. So I think there's a lot of numbers that you can still make very, very concrete, even if they're not basic salary.
Do you think that when candidates are applying for roles that they place more, like, do you think that they tend to place more value on the base salary over additional compensation such as stock options and benefits and things like that? Or do you think they don't, or do you think it's role dependent, just from your view?
Yeah, I think it's safe to say that basic salary is sort of the pillar of every job offer, and typically the number one thing that candidates will look at. So I think obviously you could make your recruiting life very, very easy by just paying astronomical base salaries, and you probably don't have much else to do. Now, obviously, the reality is that a lot of companies, and especially in the startup and scale-up world, just can't afford to pay what Google pays, right? And I think that's all right if, again, you have the right story and you have the right other types of compensation. Yes, the basic salary will have to be at a certain level. If you're trying to hire someone who's currently on a 100K package and you want to get them for 40K, that's probably just not feasible, no matter what else you offer, no matter if you have the best work-life balance, the best benefits, the best bonus potential, they probably just won't go for that. So I think it is a really, really important part of the package and the number one thing that people look at. But people who are interested in the opportunity will not consider it just because basic salary is a little bit lower if the story is right. You may offer a great benefits package, a great bonus, stock options, a great culture, work-life balance. The role and opportunity may just be really, really interesting, have a huge opportunity for growth. you may have a really diverse team, you may have any number of other things that makes the role and the opportunity really, really attractive to someone who's currently on a higher salary. So what you need is like a good, but also a really, really honest story about why you believe that the offer is the best one that a person could get, even if the basic salary is lower. I've personally actually been in a position where I turned down, where I came out of a job that paid a relatively high salary, turned down another offer with a quite attractive base salary, and went for something that was a lot more speculative, but that just had a great story around it and a great future potential, both in terms of personal growth, but also in terms of compensation. I'm also quite financially motivated, and I think that still works with something that's more speculative. So yeah, in short, I think basic salary is really, really important to people, and being somewhat competitive is sort of like a hygiene factor without which candidates just won't consider the opportunity. But if you have a great story, if you offer great equity, growth opportunities, culture, a candidate may absolutely turn down an offer that is higher in terms of base in favor of your offer. So I think getting this whole employer value proposition right is really, really important, and it's not all about base salary.
Yeah. And what do you think, and this is a conversation actually that we've started having, which is one of the questions on here that we've started having in Ben, is do you pay when you're deciding salaries for roles you're hiring for, like we benchmark our salaries based on London salaries, right? But we hire people in Berlin, we've got somebody in Barcelona, we've got somebody in Argentina. Like when you're hiring people in different remote places, should you be paying them salaries that you've benchmarked, say in London, for example, regardless of where they are, or should you be considering benchmarking in the local areas where they're living? And how would you go about that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of complexity in here. Let's try to break it down a little bit. I think if you have people in different countries, you have some people in the UK and some people in Argentina, it doesn't necessarily make sense to pay the people in Argentina the same that you pay the people in the UK, and they also wouldn't expect that. It is a different country. They're probably employed by a different entity of the company, so it's not usually perceived as unfair, and it actually makes sense to pay different packages. Now, that being said, as a startup, you probably don't have the means, or also not the willingness, to benchmark every single role for every single geography that you possibly could have. So maybe when you set up your salary banding process, you could be quite pragmatic about it, and you could have a percentage adjustment where you say, hey, we pay someone in the US, no matter for which role, we pay them 50% more than we would pay the equivalent role in the UK, or someone in Argentina 30% less than we pay an equivalent role in the UK. But I think it definitely does make sense to have differences in pay when there's different countries involved. Now, I think there's also complexity because of a lot of startups in the UK. They're also hiring remotely in the UK, right? You have people, maybe an office in London, people on London salaries, but they're actually moved out of the city and they're not coming to the office, or coming to the office very rarely. And I think there again, the answer is it depends a little bit on your strategy and your policies. If you're advertising yourself, marketing yourself as a fully remote company, you tell people in the recruitment process, you can work from anywhere, you have all the flexibility in the world, then that does imply that you feel like people can add the same value to the company, whether they're in London or Aberdeen or Newcastle. And then it feels a bit awkward to say, you can live and work anywhere, but if it's in London, we pay you more. If it's not in London, we pay you less. On the other hand, if you're a fully office-based company and you expect everyone to come to the office every day or as often as possible, you'll also want to make sure that you pay everyone London-based salaries, right? If someone has to commute really, really far to come into London, but they're still London-based, you ask them to come to the office, you'll also have to pay them a London salary. So I think that's sort of the easy cases. Then you might also have, and most companies are actually in that situation, that they're a hybrid company where some people come in only part of the month, or you have some people on a remote contract and some people on a London-based contract. It's quite interesting. This year, Google gave people the option to work from home, but they said it'll come with a substantial pay cut if they do that permanently. And based on that, we actually ran a poll with our community what they thought of that, if they thought it was fair to pay people less if they just work remotely. What do you think is the percentage of people who thought that you should have the same package no matter if you're working from home or working from the office?
Is it based in the UK, yeah?
Yeah, it's people mostly in the UK, but it was phrased very generally. Like, do you think people should have the same salary no matter whether they're working from home or from the office?
I would say like 80% said that they should have the same salary.
Yeah, spot on. 85% said it's unfair if you don't have the same package just because you're working from home or remotely if you're delivering the same thing. So I think there's very, very little acceptance of people to have different salary bands within the same company, within the same country, whether you're based in London or based outside of London, if you're delivering the same thing. So I think, long story short, I think overall, I would say you probably want to pay people within the same country the same salary, whether they're based in London or outside of London or way outside of London. As long as you have people in different locations. Like, if you don't want to have different salary band systems for the same people, whether they're in London or outside of London. Where it does make sense to pay differently is when you have a full team, or obviously your full company outside of the city, right? If your company is based in Newcastle, all of your employees are based in Newcastle, then your people wouldn't necessarily expect to get a London salary. If you have your full customer service team based outside of London, then your salary banding for that team might just be a little bit lower, but it is the same for the full team. Where it's difficult is you have some people in London, some people outside of London in the same team, and then you say, hey, we pay you salary X and we pay you salary X plus 10%. So yeah, it's not an easy question to answer.
I suppose it's like the discussions that happen before you start the actual hiring process as well, right? Like, what you actually commit to and what you decide to do, and where your talent, like how open you're going to be with your talent pool, and whether you'll accept, somebody living in, as you say, like the Midlands who's going to commute to the London office once a month, or whether you insist that they have to be in London 5 days a week or whatever. Like, that can impact what you do and what you go out to market with, I guess. Awesome. Okay. I think we've pretty much actually covered all the areas around compensation to attract talent. What do you think? Have you got the questions there?
Do you want to go into the stock option one?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, all right. So what do you think? Do you think that they're an effective tool to attract talent in the first place?
I think they can be, but they're not always. So first of all, I think what's interesting to see is there's a trend in the UK that more and more startups are actually giving stock options to all or most of their employees, while in the past they've been sort of reserved for leadership teams. So there seems to be definitely a thinking among startups and startup executives that yes, they are an effective tool for talent acquisition. The way I would think about it is maybe we do a little bit of a junior-senior split. I think in senior roles, in leadership roles, stock options can be a great substitute for cash compensation. If you're a growing business, you want to attach top-notch talent, but you just don't have the cash to pay them the same that Google would pay them, an interesting stock option package or equity can be the solution, can sort of fill that gap. So I think for senior people, to hire senior people that you just couldn't afford otherwise, stock options can be an incredibly effective tool to attract them. I think on a more junior level, the market is also very, very competitive at the moment, and good people typically have a lot of opportunities also outside of the startup world. So again, stock options could make the difference between someone accepting your offer saying, hey, I'm going into the startup, even though I could make 10% more if I went into this big corporate, because I actually have a bit of an equity component. I see that I can grow financially with the company. That being said, stock options aren't really a silver bullet there, I think. If you offer someone a salary that they can barely live off, and then you tell them as an afterthought, hey, but you'll get X amount of stock options, that won't suddenly make the offer attractive. You'll want to see equity as a part of the package, as a complement to an attractive package, but it will never be the only reason why someone joins you, especially on a junior level. If you have someone coming straight out of university, living in London, on a 25K basic salary, then $2,000 more a year will actually have a big influence on their lives and what they can afford. Whereas a stock option package seems like something very, very, something sort of very delayed, something for the future that doesn't really have a tangible benefit now. So you probably won't be able to get someone on a really, really low basic salary just because you offer them options. So I think to summarize, if you get education around stock options right, and you manage to tell people why you give them the stock options, what the value is that is associated with them, then yes, it can be a very effective tool to attract them. But by no means are they a silver bullet, and by no means can you make up for an otherwise very, very uncompetitive package just by throwing some stock options into the mix.
This might be a tricky question, but from your experience and from what you've seen, what do you like? Where do you think organizations can get information as to what a good stock option package looks like? I have been asked this before, actually, when hiring somebody, is like, what do you give them, and what does good look like for them, basically?
Yeah, there's a few quite interesting tools out there. I think number one, going back to what I said at the very beginning, is sort of network. VCs will have had these conversations with so many other companies, and they'll have data. They'll know what other companies have done, what an attractive package is. To be honest, there's also a lot that you can just find by Googling. Like if you Google what's a competitive salary for, or what's a competitive stock option package for an early stage employee, you'll get a lot of really, really cool TechCrunch articles of people, of founders relaying their experience and saying what they've done. Index Ventures, they've actually recently launched a really, really cool stock option calculator tool where they let you input where you're at in terms of your stage, what exit valuation you're going for, what role you're hiring someone in, and where then they make like a live recommendation of how much stock options you should offer them. And then finally, there's always also obviously the option of getting someone in. If you're designing a completely new stock option program, you may just get someone in who has done it before. Obviously with Payspective, we're working on equity quite a lot. It's also part of our benchmarking. There's also some other consultancies that have designed stock option schemes quite often. So that's always the big solution, I guess. Get someone in who has done this a million times before and ask them for help. But I think on a basic level, there's actually a lot of free resource out there. And going back to your VC and asking them what other companies in their portfolio do would always be the first thing that I would do.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's a question I get asked often, and then even when you get people into the business, especially more junior members who are perhaps starting out in their career, they've never encountered stock options before, and they don't know the value, and a lot of them actually don't see the value either, because they tend to, as like people tend to change jobs a lot quicker these days, so they probably don't, they're not there by the time they come to the option to vest.
But I think it's also the responsibility of the company to show people the value of the options, right? Often I get people telling me, it's so frustrating, like we have stock options, but our people don't value them. And I'm like, well, how do you explain the options to them? They're like, what do you mean explain? Like, we just give them options.
Yeah.
And then you're like, yeah, but if you don't communicate why you feel like there's value attached to these options and why you're giving them to people, and that you're also giving them to them because you hope that they will stay with you in the long run, and that you think that the company will be worth X if you stay for the long run, and then the options will pay off for this and that amount. If you don't do all of these things, if you just treat them as an afterthought, then candidates will also treat them as an afterthought. So I think the onus is really on the company to make sure that people understand the value of options.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. And educating people on that in a way that like people understand as well, because it's a super complicated topic, or can be. Cool. There was just something you touched on there, which I actually just want to ask you about, because again, like I've come across this in the last few 6-7 months, just working and recruiting and trying to attract talent, is around starting salaries and what people are looking for. Because like there's been, I don't know from what you've seen, but from what I've seen, there's been a massive inflation on this and what candidates should be expecting. But also there's like an ethical question, which you touched on, which is like, paying people enough that they can actually live on comfortably, especially in a London wage. So from what you've seen, like what do you think candidates coming out of university or starting their career, what do you think is the kind of going wage for them at the moment with no experience coming into a company starting out in London?
I think it really depends on the role. If they're an engineer, if they're a software engineer, they probably come in at 35, 40 grand, like where they can already live quite comfortably or very comfortably in London. If they come in a, say, operations role, in a customer service role, sometimes also in a marketing role, the starting salary is often still much lower than that. So say around 22 to 25, maybe 26 grand. So I do think this is picking up. And interestingly, we're actually working with a few companies that have set themselves a minimum wage that they want to pay. So they're saying we're hiring no one, random example, this is not the actual number, but they're saying we're hiring no one that we're paying less than £32,000. And I think that also comes with challenges because yes, you will be very, very attractive for grads because you're paying a lot over market, especially for these types of roles, say customer service. But then it's just hard to have the progression, right? If you're already starting in a role like that at 32 grand, then, and that's the salary that typically people have after 2, 3, 4 years in that role, then how do you progress in the organization over the next few years? So I think it's still not the case that like everyone gets a salary that you can comfortably live on in London and save some money straight out of university. I think that's just the reality of London. That's the reality of the UK. There's like sometimes quite a steep curve, but the starting point is not particularly high. But it's definitely the case now with a pretty hot market that more and more companies are asking these questions, right? What is a salary that people can properly live off of? And some companies are really going down the route of implementing like a minimum of what they think someone really needs to live. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah. No, it's really interesting. It's an interesting idea having that minimum wage and what that means to you and your organization and what knock-on impact that has, as you say. Okay, awesome. Is there any other ways that you think that you haven't covered at the moment around improving compensation without increasing salary?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really interesting question. I think there are a few ways to consider to improve compensation without increasing salary. One is improve pay per hour. Show people that they can have a balanced life within your company, and that while they could make more in a big corporate, maybe also in another startup, in a hedge fund, in a professional services environment, their pay per hour will actually be better with you. People these days put a lot of focus and emphasis on balance, a lot more so than they did 20 years ago. So I think if you can make the point that, hey, we're actually paying you really, really well per hour because we're giving you a really, really balanced life, that can land really well. I think perks and benefits are always a topic that's really, really interesting, where you can make sure that you build a company culture with the perks and benefits that you offer that makes people feel like that's a company I want to join. Maybe having a crazy offsite in Spain goes a much longer way than giving someone an extra grant in terms of base salary. So maybe you can structure your perks and benefits in a way that's aligned with your values, with your company culture, and become more attractive as an employer as a whole with that. I think bonuses are always something that you need to mention. Can be based on individual performance or on company performance. They can de-risk payroll for the company, so you don't have to go up too much on base salaries, while still making total compensation really attractive for candidates. They're also a great tool to align incentives, to make sure that people really work on the goals that you want them to work on. But obviously you'll have to make sure that you communicate them correctly, so that people actually take them into account when thinking of their total compensation. We did a lot of surveying on this topic, and 50% of people actually prefer a 5K salary increase over a 7.5K expected bonus increase. So there is a lot of risk aversion, which I think is pretty natural. But still, I think bonuses are always a valid way to increase compensation while keeping base salaries the same. And then the last one, and we discussed this a little bit, is stock options. They don't cost you any cash. They can be a great talent acquisition, but also retention and incentivization tool. As I mentioned earlier, you always want to make sure that you design your stock option system in the right way. You don't want to treat stock options as a silver bullet, but again, they can be a really, really interesting mechanism to have a competitive package without necessarily going up on base salaries too much.
Have you seen anything, sorry, just one more throwing in there. Have you seen anything that has changed in the last 12 months in particular with everything that's going on in the economy, in the world, and the pandemic and everything like that? Like any big changes or shifts when it comes to compensation that you think's been directly influenced by what's going on?
Yeah, I think what we've seen is just that it's a very hot market at the moment. Interestingly, obviously, when the pandemic started, people thought, well, maybe this is the start of a big unemployment period. Maybe Maybe the market is going to become a lot more employer-centric now, but in essence, the opposite happens. It's a very candidate-centric market. You have to be very competitive in what you offer people. And I think what's changed is that companies are becoming more creative on how they are competitive, because a startup just cannot pay the same as Google pays. And so they're just putting more emphasis on employer value proposition on a more holistic level. So they are putting more thought into how can we communicate that we're an attractive employer? How can we communicate all the other parts of our value proposition that are not basic salary that make this a really competitive offer? I get more questions like the one you just asked about what are other ways to increase compensation without increasing salary. I think companies are just becoming, they know that they have to be competitive, but they're becoming more creative in how they can display this competitiveness, and what really they're questioning more, what are really the things that people want aside from a higher basic salary.
Nice. Okay, awesome. Okay, cheers. Effective pay review processes, and then I'll definitely have a few probing questions in there, I'm sure. What does it look like?
So I'd say 3 guiding principles. A, you want to be transparent. Okay, so it should be easy for people to understand why they get the pay that they get, why they get the pay rise that they get. In an early startup phase, a lot of founders just play it by ear. They pay people by gut feel. They give people a raise that are asking for a raise. And to some extent, that's fine and inevitable at the early stages of a company. But at some point, you just want a real process and you want real transparency. Otherwise, you'll get really problematic inconsistencies, which always leads to disgruntled employees, frustrations. You may also end up with a substantial gender pay gap, because what we still see and what the research still tells us is that men are still more forward in actively asking for a raise than women. So simply having a proper process in place, having transparency around what it looks like, is half the battle won. My number 2 guiding principle would be to link a pay review process to performance. If you give everyone in a company a flat 8% pay rise, that may not send the message that you want to send. You'll want to make sure that you show appreciation to the high achievers, the people that really made a difference last year. Some people may make a small move within their level or band and get a smaller pay rise. Some people may jump a band and get a big raise, and that's totally fine. What's important, obviously, is to have that transparency that I just talked about, so that people understand why is that the case, so that you can tell them, hey, you just moved within this band, we were happy with your performance, but this other person, they achieved XYZ, we promoted them to that new role because of that, and so they're getting a higher raise. And by the way, this link to performance could also be a link to company performance. If you've done amazingly as a company and you can afford to do so, you may want to be on the more generous side. If you've done less well, you may want to structure pay rises more around the variable component rather than basic salaries. And then finally, my third guiding principle for an effective pay review process would be to be rooted in data. You'll want to make sure, and we discussed this a little bit before, that you have access to the latest and greatest, that you just adjust your salary bands or simply your salaries based on the latest market data. High inflation in a year may force you to go up with salaries more than last year. Specific roles may be super sought after at this point in time. And you'll want to make sure that you know exactly what the market rates are. So again, having a sort of one size fits all, we just give an 8% raise may not be the right approach. You want to really make sure that you know the latest and greatest. What does the data look like? Where do we have to become more competitive? Where do we need to adjust our pay? So I think transparency, linked to performance, and being rooted in data. If you have these 3 things, your pay review process is likely going to be relatively robust.
Nice. And there's a few things I wanted to probe into, if that's okay. But the first one, you talked about transparency in the process, so explaining to people like how the process works and why they're getting what they're getting and everything like that. What's your take on transparency when it comes to actual pay within the organization? So obviously companies have a legal duty to publish when they're 250 plus headcount. But what about, if you're under that, you don't have that legal duty, do you think it's important for companies to be transparent about what they pay?
Yeah, I think I think it's almost naive to think that, hey, we can just keep pay a secret and we can get away with paying one person less than another because they just won't know about it. Like even if you as a company don't have a policy that we're really transparent, people have a way of finding out and people talk, right? And especially, I think times are changing. Millennials are much more inclined to talk about money, to talk about salaries than older generations were. So I think it's just not realistic to think, hey, we have salary secrecy and nobody discusses salaries. I think in terms of what the actual policy around transparency looks like, do you need to publish everyone's salary and everyone's exact compensation package? No, probably not. If you have an open and transparent banding level and pay review process where people know, hey, if I'm on, I don't know, level 3 in software engineering, I'll make between X and Y, then that's probably already all the transparency that they're looking for. So you don't necessarily need to publish a spreadsheet that says, hey, this is everyone's salaries. But what you do want to make sure is, I always have this photocopier test in mind, where I think if one person found the other person's contract left in the photocopier, would they be surprised? Would they feel like it's unfair? Or would they be like, oh yeah, that makes sense. That's actually what I would have expected. And if it's the former, then it's probably an issue, and then that probably means that something isn't quite right.
Nice. I love that. I think that's a great question that companies should ask themselves in lots of different areas. But yeah, I think that's awesome. Okay, great. And then you talked about linking performance, so like individual performance, company performance. You talked about inflation and market rates. Do you think there's anything else companies should take into account when it comes to reviewing people's pay?
Well, I think on a very pragmatic level, you'll want to understand in the last 12 months, why have people left us? Because if you feel like you're actually paying quite competitively, but the main attrition reason was that people left because everyone just got a higher offer somewhere else, then definitely something you want to take into account. Very, very pragmatically, you'll also want to have a feeling of who are actually the key people in your organization where you're most worried that they may leave. Not because then you should suddenly give them a 30% raise and completely explode your salary banding process and all the transparency that you have. But it's definitely something to keep in mind, right? If you have someone without whom the business can't function, but they're like, you know that you have to offer them more on whatever level. Maybe it's not more salary, but maybe it's more equity, more opportunity, more whatever. Then that's pragmatically something that I would also have a look at. Nice. Okay. And then you mentioned, actually you didn't mention this, I read this in your newsletter, is that the mean percentage pay rise at the moment is 8%. So for companies that are taking into account, like, when they're reviewing, most companies, they have their budget and then they're looking, okay, what percentage are we looking to increase people's pay by? And they obviously need to take into account all the things that, you've mentioned. What would be a good idea to take those things into account? But when looking at the actual percentage, if a company wants to be competitive, would you say that 8% is a good target for companies to look at? Or do you think that for a company to be competitive, they should be looking at slightly higher than that? Yeah, I think 8% is a great rule of thumb, right? We see that across all of our data set, we see that 8% is the median annual pay rise that a startup employee gets. So you can't go majorly wrong if you aim for that approximate number. Now, that being said, that doesn't mean that everyone in your organization should get an 8% raise, right? That should probably be sort of the benchmark that you want to achieve overall. But there may be reasons why you want to be below that, reasons why you may want to be above that. That could be on an individual or on a company basis. On an individual basis, we discussed before, why give everyone an 8% pay rise if you have some high performers and some people who are maybe low performers or not such high performers, right? You might have a difference there and go above the 8% for people who are the high performers, below for the others. Also, on a company level, you may know that you come out of like a very cash restricted phase where you just didn't have a lot of money available. You were paying people probably below market in terms of base salary. You were compensating that with stock options. But now you actually have to get more competitive in terms of base salary. And so as a company as a whole, you need to be higher than 8%. You want to be 12% or 15%, just because you know you need to become competitive. So there are compelling reasons why you would want to be below or above as a company as a whole, or for a specific person. But I think it's a very, very nice benchmark to have in mind. Hey, 8% is sort of like the base case. If we deviate from that substantially as a company or for a specific person, we just want to have a reason why.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. Okay, cool. Awesome. All right. And then moving on to the pay gap, which you touched on earlier about like men in general tend to be more vocal about their pay and push a bit more on it. There's a lot of research behind that, but the pay gap is obviously still an issue. Like there's loads out there still about it. What do you think companies can do to help drive that down?
Yeah, such an important topic. I think to give a little bit of context on where the gender pay gap these days comes from, I think in the past, the main issue that people have associated with gender pay gap is you have a man, you have a woman, they're in the same position, they're doing the same job, and the man just gets paid more. So sort of blatant gender discrimination in terms of pay. This can still be a problem sometimes nowadays, but on a big scale, the major issue with gender pay gap these days is a structural one. What do I mean by that? We see that at the moment in startups and scale-ups in the UK, we have a 25% gender pay gap. So the average salary of women is 25% lower than the average salary of men. Does that mean that if a man and a woman are in the same role, typically the woman gets 25% less? No. What the 25% is driven by is two phenomena. One, there's a skew in terms of seniorities. Women are still underrepresented in senior leadership positions. That's a particularly strong phenomenon in startups, where we just see that 80% of founders are still male. And obviously in a small company, founders will make up a lot of the senior leadership positions. So the seniority skew, men tend to be in more senior roles, women tend to be in more junior roles, just leads to a very, very natural effect that women's salaries are lower than men's salaries on average. The second one, very similar argument, is a functional skew. Technical roles like software engineering, data science are still predominantly held by men, while departments like customer service, customer success, sometimes marketing, skew more female. The issue with that is that technical roles tend to be higher paid than non-technical roles. So again, that leads to a higher average pay for men than for women. So now, with that in mind, I think there are four main things that any company can do to drive that gender pay gap down. Number one, create transparency. If you don't know what your gender pay gap looks like in your company, then how can you possibly drive it down? A lot of startups, particularly before they have to report their gender pay gap, they don't really think about it. To be fair, they have a million other things on their mind. But as long as there's no reporting requirements, they just don't calculate it. So the number one thing that you want to do to drive your gender pay gap down is you want to understand how big it actually is. Create the transparency to the math. It's really, really simple. The second thing I would say is support equitable progression into leadership roles. You want to make sure that you build the right culture within the company, that you offer senior roles, also an opportunity to work part-time, for instance. You give people the flexibility to work from home when they need to, and so you give them the possibility to combine work with childcare responsibilities, which are still today, based on some of the research that we did, often still predominantly with women in the household. Encourage both men and women to take parental leave. If you encourage male employees to take parental leave, that will mean that their wives, their partners, may have to take less parental leave, less maternity leave, and be able to progress more quickly within their organization. So build a culture where you feel like it's men and women just have the same opportunity to progress into senior roles. Number three, hire women into tech roles. Make a conscious effort. Go to the relevant recruiting events. Possibly what you can do is you can widen the pool of applicants by not requiring a computer science degree. People coming out of university with a computer science degree are already 80% male. If you have the opportunity to do so, drop that requirement, train people on the job, train people through boot camps, you will just get a much, much bigger pool of great candidates for those technical roles. Visa sponsorship can also open up a whole new world of female tech talents that you couldn't access in the UK, but that you maybe can access from somewhere else in Europe, Asia, the US, from wherever. And then finally, the fourth thing I would say is make sure you have the right processes in place. We spoke a little bit before around transparency, around having a proper process in place for pay reviews. Really, really important for the gender pay gap. We see the research says that still men tend to be more active in asking for pay rises than women. So if you only ever give pay rises to the people that ask for it, you're much more likely to end up with a substantial gender pay gap. If you have a really, really good process in place where people actually get a raise based on very, very transparent and objective metrics that they or the company achieve, then that's much, much less likely to happen. So to summarize, 4 key things: create transparency, make sure you have equitable progression of men and women into senior roles, hire women into tech roles, and put the right processes in place for pay reviews.
I love that. That's great. Thank you. Just so many important things there. And I feel very passionately about the parental leave one in particular, Patrick, as you can imagine, I'm sure. Yeah, absolutely. And then just for the last, just few minutes, I would just love a very quick nugget from you around diversity and pay gaps related to diversity. I know, I've seen one of Payspective's benchmarking reports before, and I know that you guys look at that and take that into consideration when it comes to pay. So I would just love just a brief overview from you about what you think the issue is there and how companies can help drive that down as well, if you've got time.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think to some extent you can't necessarily, how should I say this? To some extent, it's just a societal phenomenon, right? That diverse candidates, diverse talent, diverse people, they're underrepresented already when you look at private school system, when you look at the university system. So already when you get people to apply to roles within your company, you'll just have a skew that it's not completely in line with population averages in terms of if you just have a lot of high, how should I say this? Yeah, you know what I mean, right? People already get into the system, into the university system, say, when you only look at the population at a university, it's already not representative to the population as a whole, right? So if you hire out of universities, already you will probably hire more non-diverse candidates, more white candidates in the UK context than diverse candidates. So I think it's not necessarily something, it's a bit less clear cut as with the gender pay gap, where the reason why, where it's much more difficult for companies to actually influence the diversity pay gap within their organization. I think, again, one really, really important thing is to have the transparency. If you just look around, you may feel, hey, we're actually a diverse team, but you may want to know, hey, how does this compare to other companies? Are we really that diverse? I think an important thing is also to define diversity the right way for you as a company. Is diversity just ethnicity? Probably not. Probably it's also age, it's also gender, maybe it's also academic backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds. So if you can get that data, and if you can get the transparency within your organization, hey, how do people identify? How does that also compare to how people in other companies identify? Then I think that that's a really, really good first step in understanding where the issue actually is. Is the issue, is there actually an issue within your company? Is the issue that you're not representative of the London population as a whole, which is very diverse, but you're still overrepresented in terms of minorities compared to other companies or compared to the university population? I think just having the data and having the transparency, again, goes a very long way.
I wonder to what extent companies are measuring all those different data points as well, and actually starting to take all of those into account. So obviously the gender pay gap's been topical for a number of years now, whereas I don't really hear people talking about diversity pay gap enough, and they should be, because I'm sure that there'll be work to do there as well for organizations. But anyway, could talk about lots of this for a very, very, very long time. That was just so good and really helpful, and some really, really useful stuff there. So thank you so much. Really appreciate it.